Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Bob Kincaid, thank you so very much. Welcome, everyone, to today's edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is an absolutely gorgeous Tuesday in May. It is the 19th day of May. And as usual, on Tuesday, we are beginning 30 minutes later than we usually do. It's just gone 1:30 p.m. here in the East. I know that some of you are listening. Apparently, Robert Kraft of the New England Patriots is holding a press conference right now. I just, before we went on the air, I just caught wind of the fact that it was on. I'm guessing that a lot of people are listening to it. I wasn't able to stay around for the press conference, but given the coverage that's already been going on with this, I don't think I'll have any trouble finding out what happens and what Robert Kraft says. But I kind of suspect that what he's basically gonna do is kind of agree to stop this hysteria, this much ado over nothing that seems to have erupted in this country over deflated footballs. But be that as it may, welcome to today's program. I want to thank you for your willingness to give up portions of your time, your valuable time, in such an absolutely gorgeous part of the year, of the spring season, as mid-May. It is absolutely beautiful here. We had a little bit of a rain issue in some areas surrounding our area in Appalachia over the last couple of days, but I believe that has moved out, and we're looking at several days of rain-free, rather beautiful weather. So, and I think it is beginning right now. It is an absolutely gorgeous afternoon here in Appalachia. Welcome to today's program. I do want to continue the theme that we started yesterday, which was on what I call I'm trying to put together the outlines or the beginnings of a piece that I'd like to write on a revised role for unions in order to address some of the issues involved in what Rich's Senate has called the new capitalism. And I think that most people would see this, given the precipitous decline in union membership of late. I think most people would see this challenge of new capitalism as a threat, as potentially the beginning of the end for unions in this country as we've known them. I don't have any trouble with the phrase "as we've known them," but I do think that unions potentially have a great role to play. I think this potentially can be seen as a tremendous opportunity for a rebirth of union activity in America. I think it's going to involve an awful lot of compromise on both sides. I think it's going to involve a totally different way of looking at some of the issues and some of the challenges that we face. But to be very honest with you, that's what I envision our program today, our 90 minutes today being about. These are all my own ideas for the most part. But I am intrigued by the potential of the situation. And I think what we've done in previous programs here at the Virtual Center is to lay out the ingredients of the challenge. And based on that, I've spent some time putting together what I believe is a way that we can meet that challenge and successfully overcome some of the biggest threats, at least, of the so-called new capitalism. I would love to give our listeners an opportunity to hear your ideas and your thoughts on some of these issues about work, about unemployment, about technological advance and the communications revolution, about the nature of the so-called global economy, all of it. I would love to hear from you. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate your thoughts and ideas to me directly, I would welcome those. And I know that some people are reluctant to get on the air and talk to the world, so to speak. I can surely understand that. I just came from a program, a Rotary program here locally, and this program today was so interesting and so important for our community. And I felt bad for the person delivering it because he obviously was not really that comfortable in making a presentation, even though he's the one with the expertise that could handle the questions. And it was very clear that he couldn't wait to get to the question and answer, because I think he felt like he could handle questions. But in terms of making a formal proposal or putting together a presentation, I really think that he was not comfortable, and I can understand that. And I know that there are some people out there listening to the Virtual Center who perhaps listen all the time, who would die before they would pick up the phone and get on the air, and I can understand that. If you feel much more comfortable by sending me an email and sharing your thoughts and your ideas with me one-on-one, I would love to hear from you, and I will tell you that, if the things that you are saying seem to contribute to our overall understanding of the issues involved, and if indeed it appears that your thoughts and your ideas, your suggestions, whatever they might be, would be of value to other people, then I would avail myself of the opportunity to share your thinking with other listeners here at the Virtual Center. I obviously wouldn't identify you except by the name that you choose to let me have, and it doesn't even have to be your own. If you want to come up with a bogus name that in order to shield your identity, that's more than okay with me, because I think what we're after here is the thinking and the ideas. And I know that if you have something to say and you are willing to take the time to put it in an email, then it's worth all of us hearing, listening to, and taking time to reflect upon. So my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN, 906@gmail.com. It was interesting that just a moment ago in kind of giving a very quick overview of some of the challenges of the so-called new capitalism, I meant to mention one of the major challenges, which is obviously the issues associated with the emergence of what we call the global economy. I don't think in many cases all of us spend as much time as we should thinking about that and thinking about its implications. However, I would remind you that before free enterprise capitalism involved industrialism and manufacturing on a grand scale, it involved commerce. It's not at all a surprise that the early stages of capitalism historically are defined or identified by the term mercantilism, the emphasis being on the role of merchants in the emergence of international commerce and the international markets that began to develop with the buying and selling of goods back and forth across the oceans and across borders from one realm or one kingdom into another. And so I think that the issue of global trade and the idea of so-called free trade, as we open up the world to the ebb and flow of commerce and the buying and selling of manufactured goods and raw materials and all the rest of it. And of course, now we have to recognize that the global economy includes also the movement of capital back and forth across the globe. Consequently, these international trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that is being debated and struggled over in Washington right now, I think these bear very, very close scrutiny and very, very close watching. Earlier this morning, I was reading an account of the struggles surrounding the TPP, so-called. Many of you over the last several days have have picked up the controversy between Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts and President Obama over this specific issue. In fact, President Obama made the comment that while he and Elizabeth, and of course he uses her first name very affectionately, have agreed so often on so many important issues and items, they disagree on this one. And as President Obama says, on this one, Elizabeth is wrong. And Elizabeth's response is that she is not wrong. And she has substantive reasons for that. And of course, the issue is, and I think all of us can appreciate this, especially those of us who have been regular participants here at the Virtual Center, I think we can all appreciate the fact that there is, there are oftentimes winners and losers. We love to believe when we talk about opportunity, et cetera, and negotiation and compromise and deals and trade and partnerships of any kind, we like to believe that they are win-win situations for everybody, but we understand in the real world that frequently it turns out that there are sometimes winners and losers. And oftentimes who wins and who loses are determined by who happens to have the most political influence at a particular time, because these agreements, these deals, are negotiated between governments. And so therefore, whichever interest group might have the government's ear at a particular point in time can get favorable treatment in these international partnerships, global trade agreements, and it can end up benefiting some people but seemingly hurting other people. And that's what we're into here, because Elizabeth Warren's position is that this agreement, like previous ones, and I'm thinking specifically of NAFTA, most people will agree that NAFTA was probably the most instrumental factor that we can point to for the relocation of good jobs from continental United States into other areas of the world where labor seemed to be much cheaper for manufacturers and for employers generally. And so the fact of the matter is many of our largest industries have relocated overseas. Some of them for tax purposes and some of them for access to cheap labor and growing markets and all the rest of it. Elizabeth Warren claims that with that kind of a track record, we have to look very, very carefully at this current agreement. President Obama's response to that is that if one is realistic about it, one realizes that most of those who were going to relocate, to move, in order to gain access to cheaper labor have already done so. I think what President Obama's position is that the people who are in danger of being most seriously harmed by international trade agreements have already experienced that pain. And that now what we're looking for is the long-term benefits of expediting the flow of goods and services back and forth across borders and across oceans. And so President Obama has seemingly concluded that this agreement is an overall positive for the United States, and he's encouraging passage of it. However, he's experiencing most of the opposition to this agreement from members of his own party, from Democrats. And in fact, there are significant numbers of Democrats who have spoken out and have lined up against this particular legislation. And irony of ironies, it seems to be Republicans in Congress that seem more willing to get behind President Obama and try to get this TPP program through. So I think it's very significant. However, one of the things that you can keep in mind, and I'll drop this topic right now with just this comment, but one of the things I think is significant is that while Congress is going to vote up or down on this agreement, which gives President Obama tremendous flexibility in negotiating trade agreements with other nations, another factor is that this agreement, it seemingly, at least according to the president, is written in such a way that it will also extend into the incoming president, depending on who wins the election of 2016. So it's not an agreement that's going to end when President Obama's term of office ends, but in effect it's going to impact on the next administration as well, whichever party that might control that particular election. But one of the things that is very interesting is that while Congress is ultimately going to have to vote up or vote down on this particular agreement, the fact of the matter is there aren't that many members of Congress who really know what's in the agreement. It's secret. And the administration's position is when you're dealing with trade legislation like this, it has to be somewhat secret. You can't reveal all your negotiating positions with those that you're going to be doing business with. So therefore, there's an element of secrecy is appropriate and, according to the administration, called for. However, the fact of the matter is that puts Congress in a position of voting on things for things or against things that it hasn't even read. And of course, while that seems shocking on its surface, of course, we know, those of us who follow politics even half regularly recognize that as often as not, members of Congress have voted on legislation in the past that they haven't read either. So this is really nothing new. Most of the time, as we know, the data seems to suggest that more often than not, congressmen vote for or against particular issues and items based on who's for it and who's against it. And I think all of us need to recognize that reality. It's really interesting. We were talking, if you remember, several weeks ago here at the Virtual Center, we were talking about the role of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, that was drafting model pieces of legislation and running them through state legislatures by giving them to its members, and then the members would organize the local legislature and try to drive the particular piece of legislation through that state. And so consequently, states were, one after the other, were dealing with issues like abandoning prevailing wage and passing right-to-work legislation and abandoning support for the Common Core standards and passing legislation affecting patriotism of our young people by controlling curriculum and what will and what will not be in our history and in our government programs in our K through 12 public school systems and all the rest of it. And what, the point that I was making here at the Virtual Center is that the kind of money, large interest money, big corporate interest money that's behind ALEC, and of course everybody mentions the Koch brothers because they're a major contributor, but so also are other major corporations as well. And what we've been talking about, and what I've been talking about, in fact, I submitted a piece to the Charleston Gazette here in West Virginia on this particular issue, is that what we have is kind of an insidious approach to the idea of voting the straight party ticket. Traditionally, we've been critical of voters who push one button and vote all Democrat or all Republican, no matter who the candidates are or what the offices are. They just vote straight party. And for a long time, people have been opposed to that because it seems to breed and speak to the issue of voter ignorance and all the rest of it. In fact, here in West Virginia, one of the things our new Republican legislature did at the outset of the recent session was pass legislation abolishing straight ticket voting here in West Virginia. In order to cast votes for all Democrats or all Republicans in West Virginia, each voter is going to have to basically make an independent decision on each particular office being contested. It's no longer going to be possible to just push one button and have votes registered for everybody of a particular party. And so basically, from a political and philosophical point of view, that seems to be a good thing. I don't think anybody would take too strong a position against that. In fact, Republicans in West Virginia were more than willing to take credit for pushing that legislation, even though in the past straight ticket voting here in West Virginia has benefited Democrats, not Republicans. So what they're basically saying is this is a position that we're taking for reasons of principle, not reasons of self-interest. I mean, reality, we know that West Virginia has moved into the red state column, and of course, straight ticket voting now in recent years has tended to benefit Republicans more than Democrats. But that's a minor difference. The fact of the matter is, most people support the concept on principle. It seems the right thing to do. But one of the things that I was trying to emphasize here at the Virtual Center was that what we see with big money as a result of Citizens United in our political campaigns, with big money influencing our elections and big money driving the ALEC agenda, the American Legislative Exchange Council agenda, the fact of the matter is we seem to have a much more invisible, or much less visible, I should say, version of straight ticket voting, if you will, going on within government rather than from the citizens outside government. And what I'm talking about is the extent to which this influx of big money is being used to coerce elected representatives to vote the party line, to vote the party ticket. In the case of ALEC, to vote the agenda that ALEC supports. And it's a rather negative approach to the use of big money. Of course, the use of big money in the eyes of many people, and myself included, is not very positive anyway. But most of the time, when we think about big money in politics, we're talking about buying influence over buying votes, in other words, buying influence with particular members of legislatures in order to secure their vote on a particular issue. But what we see happening now is a little bit less visible than that, and I think a little bit more insidious than that. Because what appears to be happening is that recently elected members, for example, in West Virginia, in our new Republican majority, are expected to vote the party line. And if they don't, then this seemingly endless stream of money that the party has access to here will be used to defeat these particular outliers from getting reelected. In other words, if you want to retain your seat, you will do as you are told, and you will vote as you are told. And if you don't, we'll guarantee that you will not be reelected. Because we will make sure that the person who runs against you next time will have enough money to make sure that he or she defeats you. And we've seen in recent elections examples of this playing out in some of the more astounding upsets in our electoral history. I'm thinking the one I have in mind is Eric Cantor outside Richmond. Eric Cantor was the head of the Republican Finance Committee in Congress when the Republicans were in a minority in the House. And he lost his seat in 2014 to a novice running for political office who happens to be a professor at a local university there, who was backed big time by conservative money from these groups supported by the Koch brothers and others. So Eric Cantor, as important, as prestigious as he was within the Republican caucus in Washington, was not immune from defeat. That's a message that is being sent around to make sure that nobody can miss it. Why am I into this right now? I mean, how is this related to our program? Well, I had mentioned a few minutes ago that that this indeed was a factor when we talk about things like international trade. And people are put in a position of having to vote a particular party. It's, I guess the most obvious example that I would give is it can't be an accident, if you think about it, that all Republicans in Congress, and now the Republicans have a majority in Congress in the United States, which, as you know, if 435 members, half of the Congress, you need better than half the Congress to be a majority. So probably something in the area of 240 some odd members of Congress. I think the number that keeps popping into my mind right now is 246 Republicans. It seems to be unbelievable that all but only a few of those would vote consistently, time after time. The data shows. Larry Kramer, we talked earlier about Larry Kramer, the former dean of Stanford Law School, who is leading the Hewlett Foundation in a charge in order to try to build back or reinvigorate the idea of two-party politics in Congress, in our governments. Larry Kramer points out in his data that we've got situations where people of the same party are voting together 90, 92, 93% of the time. It's unbelievable that 240 people would agree that often on anything. If you read James Madison, who was a really astute student of human behavior, especially political behavior, Madison would pointed out that that's the basis of factionalism in our nation, is the fact that, as he says in Federalist Number 10, people tend to disagree about anything and everything. So how could it possibly be that 246 people could agree on an issue, and then the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one? What I'm suggesting is there's got to be something that's pushing these people to vote together. And what I'm suggesting is what's pushing these people to vote together is the threat of big money being used to defeat you at the ballot box if you should step out of line and not support the party agenda. In our recent system here in West Virginia, for example, one of the major pieces of legislation that our legislature dealt with was a move to abolish prevailing wage legislation in West Virginia, where periodically unions and contractors in the building industry are being polled in order to get a read on what kind of wages are being paid to certain craft unions, for example, carpenters and plumbers and architects and electricians and such. And based on that, an average wage or the average wage is being determined. And there's been a lot of concern that most of the people responding to these surveys are union people, and so consequently the final result of the establishment of the prevailing wage is always higher than it really is. The argument being there are a lot of non-union people that aren't making the prevailing wage. And that was used principally as a vehicle to try to steamroll the elimination of prevailing wage legislation in West Virginia. Well, when this came up, union people responded very strongly, and the Capitol was full of working people who were putting pressure on and lobbying Congress not to do this. The result was that the prevailing wage legislation in West Virginia was not repealed, but it was amended. It was amended in such a way that in the future the prevailing wage will be determined by going in different directions. The assumption is that prevailing wages will tend to go down. This in a state where more than half the people of working age aren't working. So it seemed to many people, myself included, a little bit contradictory to be tampering with prevailing wage legislation in a state where more than half the people can't find jobs. and to look at the jobs that do pay a living wage and basically try to make the case that these people are making too much, as if you took it away from them, it would go to the people who aren't working, which we know is not true. It's very obvious that if prevailing wages are lowered, the benefits are going to go to the employers, not to unemployed and underemployed workers. But that's another issue. The fact of the matter is, here in West Virginia, we had one particular Democrat from a county here in southern, an adjoining county here to Beckley, which is Wyoming County, and a member of the Senate who ran as a Democrat. Let it be known that if his switch from Democrat to Republican mattered, he would make it after the election. So lo and behold, what we ended up with in the results of the 2014 election here in West Virginia was a tie for the state Senate. I believe it was 17-17 or 18-18, whatever it was a tie. And that meant that one switch would give control of the state Senate to Republicans. And this particular senator made it be known that he was willing to make that switch, and he did. And so therefore, from the beginning of the session on, the Republicans, of course, could claim that they had a majority in both houses of the West Virginia legislature. But in fact, they had a majority of one in West Virginia. In other words, one vote switch did it. Well, my point here is just to give you an example of what is causing people to vote consistent party. And of course, it's big money. A very close friend of mine was sharing with me this past weekend of a conversation that he had with this particular member of the Senate who he's been friends with for some time. And the issue under discussion was the call for an Article 5 convention, which was another ALEC project here in West Virginia. And my friend basically let his friend be known in the legislature, be very careful before you vote for this, he said, because there's a lot more to this particular legislation. And his comment was, read a couple of the Federalist Papers, for example. In other words, he was picking up on things that we've talked about here at the Virtual Center. Cautions about voting for an Article 5 second convention without really being aware of what the full ramifications of the vote could be about. And the response he got from his friend after the call for a prevailing wage was approved in the in the particular committee that was handling it, the person texted back to my friend and said, I understand your concerns about the Article 5 convention, but I have to vote with the caucus. I have to vote with the caucus. So basically what he was doing was admitting that the agenda for the caucus is being written outside the legislature. It's being written outside the state. It's being written by ALEC and is being driven by the big money that is funding ALEC. It's proof positive of what we've been saying here at the Virtual Center all the way through that whole issue about the calling of a second convention. So back to the point about the Trans-Pacific Partnership vote and who's for it and who's against it. Chances are that those with the loudest voice, which means the most money, are calling the shots here and are determining who votes how. And I would suggest to you the model of representative government, the model of the republic that the founders gave us and defended so vociferously, implied that each elected representative, be it senator or congressman, be it state legislator or be it state senator, each elected representative, if republicanism is to work, must take and pay the most attention to the views of his or her constituents. What we're seeing here is most attention is being paid to the people kicking in the big money, not the constituents. So what we had here in West Virginia, for example, is a legislative chamber packed with working people, union people, who were there opposing tampering with prevailing legislation, but it passed anyway. Repeal didn't pass, but a significant amendment passed. Not only that, but because those pushing prevailing wage repeal got half a loaf rather than a whole loaf, they could leave the session bragging about the fact that they were tolerant and they were responsible for the compromise. So what they did was bow to the pressure of being afraid to repeal it outright. So they amended it and then took credit for that and tried to say that it was testimony to their being so moderate on this particular issue. We have to believe that the same kind of procedure is happening behind the scenes with major trade legislation like the TPP. And so this, I would suggest to you, is extremely, extremely important to be aware of and keep abreast of. We obviously, in our abbreviated programs on Tuesday, we usually don't stop at the top of the hour for a break since we've only been on the air for 30 minutes. So we are now at 10 minutes after the hour. So we've been here about 40 minutes, and we've got about 50 minutes to go. So if it's all right with you, I'd like to just to continue to move and pick up on the theme that we were talking about yesterday. If you recall yesterday, we were talking about unions. We were talking about the inconsistencies and contradictions between the way we define the ideal worker under what we called, for convenience sake, the old capitalism, as opposed to the ingredients or the characteristics of the ideal worker in the new capitalism. And this is, of course, Richard Sennett. And he basically acquainted us with some of the characteristics, if you will, that seem most in demand under the new capitalism, which is, mobility and flexibility and independence, freedom, and all those other things that we talked about. And what this suggests is that the priorities of the game have changed somewhat. And we talked in an earlier program about some of the factors that changed the game, which is the shift from long-term to short-term goals, the shift in increasing power in the hands of shareholders, and the tendency of investors to seek short-term profit at the expense of long-term gain, and to demand bottom-line profits, increases in the share of stocks. And it's the buying and selling of those stocks that generate the short-term profit in the contemporary market. And we talked about the extent to which this was so contradictory with the priorities for which most people enter the market. And I'm talking about working people whose retirement and IRAs is invested in the market. And what brought them in was the idea of long-term gain. But here we have these people who are looking for short-term profit that are skewing the nature of the game. They are literally affecting the results of millions and millions of people who have bought into this for their retirement, their entire working lives, and everything that they're able to accumulate is invested in the market. And here we have these heavy investors, these big guys that are sitting at computers and moving tens of thousands of shares of stock back and forth in a moment's call, and affecting the ups and downs and the values of the market. In a sense, we have the vast majority of people investing in the stability of the market, and we have a small number of heavy investors, day traders, who are manipulating the rules of that investment. In effect, we have bought chips and we have invested them on the roulette table, and we are letting somebody else, we have given our chips to somebody else, and we are letting them play with our money and our futures. And those, it seems to me, are the kinds of changes that have occurred which have changed the dynamics of the game in the new capitalism. And in the process, the emphasis on freedom and independence, the idea of not being tied down or tied with responsibilities or being accountable to anyone, is being reflected in the data and the research that sociologists are giving us in the so-called millennials. People are less inclined to marry. People are less inclined to belong to an established church. People are less inclined to belong to unions. People are less inclined to belong to or to contribute time and money to civic organizations. In other words, people seem to be desirous of maintaining their freedom and their flexibility and their maneuverability. All of this, it seems to me, has worked against the best interests of organized labor, of unions as we know them. The result has been that as these changes have occurred in the economy, they are reflected in the precipitous decline of membership in unions. And in our program yesterday, I was able to share with you some data that I put together over the weekend that would give us some substantive evidence or examples of how precipitous this decline in union membership has become. 36% of working people in the mid-1950s belonged to unions. By 1989, that 36% had dropped to 16%. And of course, I made mention of the fact that it's 1989, of course, is the year after President Reagan left office. And we know with the air traffic controllers situation, what damaged President Reagan was able to do to organize labor in this country. But it didn't stop. The decline didn't stop with the leaving of Ronald Reagan. By 2008, the very year that Barack Obama was elected president, the 16% of union membership had declined to 12.4%. And the bulk of that 12.4% was made up of enrollment in public sector unions, police unions, firemen's union, teachers unions, etc., etc. Because the precipitous decline in private sector industry continued unabated. In 2008, private sector union membership was down to 7.6%. So the difference between the 7.6% and the 12.4% reflects the strength of public sector union membership. The most recent data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics indicates for 2014 that the slippage in union membership seems to have bottomed out somewhat, or at least has ceased to be as dramatic. There was a 0.2% decline in union membership from 2013 to 2014. But the Bureau of Labor Statistics tells us that public sector union membership continued to outstrip private sector membership by 5-1. In other words, for every member of a union who works in private industry, there are 5 union members who work in the public sector. So there's absolutely no question then that the data supporting the demise, precipitous demise of union membership in America is significant. So the question is union membership in part decline, at least in part, because unions are so contradictory and out of favor in light of the changes that constitute the so-called new capitalism? I am suggesting that indeed that helps explain it. Those who seek to destroy unions, and that's what Right to Work is about, those who seek to destroy unions are using an argument that unions inhibit individual freedom and that working people ought to have the freedom to join or not join unions as they choose. Non-union members should be allowed the freedom to address to and move and make independent decisions based on their own best interests in the contemporary economy. They shouldn't be limited or restricted in what they can do or what they can say by a union. And their money shouldn't be taken in union dues to support causes that they may or may not support. So it is my position that the precipitous decline in union membership in this country is, at least in part, consistent with the emergence of the characteristics of the so-called new capitalism. It is also my position that the push, and this is again an ALEC push, for right-to-work legislation in state after state around the nation is an effort to stick the dagger finally into the heart of organized labor in this country. Once unions are forever defeated, once they disappear, once workers are free, then the reality is they become totally powerless. Workers become powerless to affect decision making. And no longer do those that would control the marketplace and industry have to worry about and deal with the opposition of organized labor. As dire as this situation seems to be, as I mentioned at the end of the program yesterday, I believe that this changed situation provides a tremendous opportunity for unions to redefine themselves and to reemerge as significant factors in the new capitalism. I think that the opportunities are there because so much of what was part of the old capitalism is disappearing. And much of what's disappearing are issues and factors and considerations that as individual citizens none of us want to see happen. In other words, if we really understood it all, most of us would be opposed to some of the negatives associated with the emergence of the new capitalism. we would be opposed to the idea of so many people being unable to find work at all, or so many people being forced to accept employment that is a lot less in income and a lot less in prestige than they are used to or than that they have been educated for. The new capitalism has created incredible element of dislocation within our working constituents in our country, within our working people. Not only that, but many of the so-called fringe benefits associated with work, like tolerance and planning and self-reliance and dependency and responsibility and accountability and pride in one's work and pride in the job well done and pride in what we do, and all of those things are being lost, or at least suffering measurable decline. And if there was a way to protect those things and keep them part of the new capitalism, I am betting that the vast majority of working people would support that. A vast majority of citizens would support that. Because what's happening to working people right now, the unemployment and the inability to find new employment, and the fact that many people are raising children and grandchildren where the inability to find work is transferring from one generation to the next. And we are raising a generation of young people in this country that have never worked or never have even been in a home where somebody works. But more important than that, we are witnessing a number of people who are living in, youngsters who are living in homes where the breadwinners are working 2 jobs and 3 jobs. They're never home. They're not raising their kids. They're not teaching their kids. They're not reading to their kids. They're not educating their kids into being good citizens and good students and all the rest of it. Many of our young people are totally unsupervised. There's nobody there when they get out of school at the end of the day. In other words, the impact of the new capitalism on our social fabric, on the ingredients that makes this republic function, are monumental. The impact is monumental. It seems to me that not only is there opportunity, not only is the time ripe for unions to make a comeback, but I would suggest the situation is drastic enough that unions can begin to provide a valuable service, a needed service for our society at large. In the process of reconstituting and redefining themselves, unions can become vital parts of a changing, dynamic society. Unions organize labor, the voice of working people, the voice of those people who care about work, who care about quality, who care about pride in a job well done. That voice can get back at the table and be heard. It is a voice that does not require mass demonstrations and strikes and picketing and violence and all of those other things that have been associated with labor history in this country. Our corporations, our employers, are engaged in life or death competition for the markets and the consumers of the world. The one ingredient that they have going for them more than anything else is quality. The greater the pride that our working people take in their jobs and in what they do, the more likely it is that employers are going to be successful in the international game of global trade and commerce. increasingly, unions can become the voice, the representative, the spokesman for that point of view. Not only will it be heard, it'll be solicited, it'll be sought after. Because in reality, if you think of how this game is going to be won or lost in our competition with China, for example, it's going to be won or lost based on our ability to do a better job at what we do than anybody else. And that's going to require the skills and the commitment of our working people. Their interests are vital to the nation's success, to the economy's success. Unions can make that case, and I believe they can win it. Not only do I think that they can make the case and win it, I think they are duty-bound to do just that. Since our program yesterday, I thought that it would be incumbent upon me to take time in our program today to spell out at least some of the specifics of this new unionism that I've been talking about now for 2 days. In other words, what are some of the very specific things that unions can do and should do to get the best interests of working people back on the table? Recognizing when we talk about working people, we're not just talking about people in the service industry. We're not just talking about minimum wage workers at Walmart and those kind of places. We're not just talking about people who work for tips in restaurants. We're not just talking about people that work on the front desk at hotels. We're not talking about the people who clean the rooms and run the vacuum cleaners in our hotels. We are talking about them, but we're not talking about just them. We're also talking about those who are being educated and trained in the latest technology. We're talking about programmers. We're talking about computer science experts. We're talking about those people who can become proficient in coding. We're talking about those people that can become instrumental and vital in the technological and digital revolution that is taking over the world. We are talking about revitalizing our entire economy. And we're talking about doing it in a way which inculcates respect and dignity for the value of work and for the people who do it, whatever they do. How can unions do this? I think, first of all, we have to recognize that if unions can successfully do this, if they can pull this off, membership will flock to the unions. The unions, the voice of working people, will become vital. It'll be heard. Their interests will be so strong that employers will have to listen. Corporate interests will have to listen. Investors, bankers will have to listen. Government will have to listen. Government's approach to regulating the economy, to managing trade and commerce, to managing relations between different groups of people, those kinds of government decisions and activities will be driven clearly with the voice of those who work in the forefront of the decisions that are made. Workers need not only to be able to influence employers, corporations. They need to be able to influence government because government literally is making the rules. It's the ability of investors and Wall Street banks and corporations to write the rules and influence government that putting workers in such a bind under the new capitalism. They've got to become strong enough to get back to the table so that their positions and their issues and their interests can not only be heard, but can be accommodated. What are some of the specific roles that unions can play? I'm going to throw out a couple because I jotted down a couple before going on the air today. And when I say a couple, I need to be very specific. I've listed 14, but I know there are more. I welcome your emails or your calls. If you can think of other roles that unions might be able to fulfill in this new world of work, then I encourage you to call or to drop me an email and let me know. I don't want to leave anything out. So let me begin. What might representatives of working people in this new age bring to the process? Well, the most obvious thing, it seems to me, is to represent the voice, the interests of working people. Not just skilled working people, not just college-educated working people, all working people. Because the voice we want out there is the voice that will reinvigorate opportunity in this dynamic, changing economic system. We want to reinvent what many of us are beginning to think was more myth than reality anyway. We want it to be reality. We want to bring about the kinds of dynamic changes that inject real opportunity for growth and mobility back into the economy. We want to reinvigorate an environment where people who are willing to go to work or to take training or go to community college or get graduate degrees or whatever it is are rewarded with the opportunities available. We want to end the process of people going to school and incurring tremendous personal debt to get degrees and secure training that they can't use, that they can't find jobs to accommodate. And consequently, they're forced to take positions which don't even begin to approach the skills and the abilities that they have. We want work to be able to accomplish all the things for people that we grew up believing work can and should do for people. So the most obvious role for organized labor, if you wanted to call it that, is to represent workers. How? It seems to me that in this new way of looking at the system, at the issue, the voice of working people needs to be a voice which brings to the table the needs and wants and desires and druthers of working people. but also is familiar with the voice and the needs and the interests and the priorities of those who employ working people, corporations, international manufacturing companies, investment firms. In other words, we want a voice in order to make sure that the priorities of working people fit into the kinds of changes that are happening in our economy rather than being rendered permanently outside those decisions. We want these representatives to be able to sit at the table with those corporate leaders who make major decisions affecting the workplace and affecting the conditions of work. And we know in this digital age that a lot of this workplace, this idea of workplace, is more abstract than it ever was before. Because under the old capitalism, the idea was that when people worked, they went to a job and they performed it and they came back home. Now we know in the digital age, we have people who work from home. We have people whose accountability and responsibilities are measured in jobs completed or projects completed or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, while the definition of the workplace is changing, the realities of the experience do not. And what we've got to do is find people who are in tune with and aware of what's happening in a rapidly changing, dynamic world economic system and are able to come to the table with recommendations to represent the best interests of working people in this kind of a changing environment. We're talking about representatives of working people, unions, if you will, who are well educated. We're talking about people who know the old animal, who know the economy, who know economics, who know interpersonal relations, who know about interests, who are familiar with sociology, who are familiar with business, who are aware of long-term planning, who know how the international process of investment and movement of capital happens. What we are talking about then is the creation of an education program, an undergraduate, graduate program that would train representatives of working people to become leaders in the dynamics of a growing, vibrant, changing economic system. We need to manufacture our leaders. When we begin to turn out the kind of well-educated people that we're talking about, there's no way that corporate heads or financial heads can lock the door on them. There's no way that it can keep them out of the room or away from the table. Because these people come with power. They not only come with the power to speak for their members, they come to the table with the power of knowledge, of insight, of vision. And the success of our economy is going to be dependent on their inclusion and doomed to failure without it. That, I would suggest, is the role of the union representative, the spokesman for working people in the new age. In other parts of the developed world except the United States, in Western Europe, in Scandinavia, there is a principle defining the relationship between management and labor, between employers and employees, which is usually defined or called codeterminism. In West Germany, for example, spokesmen for working people, union representatives, by law are required to be at the table when major corporate decisions affecting working people are being made. The law forbids employers to make decisions affecting workers without providing an opportunity for the voice of working people to be there and to have input. Codetermination never took off in this country, principally because of the hostility between management and labor and because of the anti-union bias that has built up in this country over the years. We've got to overcome that. We have got to insist that codetermination or something like it take root in this country and work and become a vital part of a new age. Throughout this country, we have trade schools. We have community colleges. We have four-year colleges and universities, public and private. We have graduate schools. We have professional schools, law schools, medical schools, etc. We have an educational establishment in this country that always was considered to be second to none, but no longer. I think at least up to this point, our colleges and universities have been able to maintain their edge. But I don't know how long that's going to last. Look at the data. Look at the number of prestigious graduate programs in this country in engineering, in science. Where incoming graduate students are 75-80% international students. I mentioned here at the Virtual Center some time ago my wife's son, who this past summer, just 1 year ago, graduated with a master's degree from Duke University in engineering. He was in a program called engineering management. There were 20 graduate students in his class. 18 of the 20 were from outside the United States. By design. Duke University recognized that the quality of the graduate programs, especially in engineering, required the ability to move smoothly in a changing, dynamic, international world of work and challenges. Our education system is in place. However, if you look at the history of our education system in this country, we have never been able to find a way to link workplace education with higher education. We have never been able successfully to find a way that the classroom and the workplace can speak the same language. Employers have been screaming for endless years that they are getting graduates with no skills. They are getting college graduates, university graduates who can't do anything. They're getting high school graduates who are unemployable unless they're hired at the very basic level, which is flipping burgers. So that's the classic example, I think. And most of their workplace education has to be done on the job because our colleges and universities and trade schools seemingly have not been up to the challenge. We have got to find a way to bring workplace and campus together. How to do it? How would unions fit into this? It seems to me that those who represent working people need to sit on college curriculum committees. They need to be at the table when professors design curriculum. Now that's not easy. This is my game, so let me try to avoid going off on a tangent here. But the one thing I know after half a century in higher education is that generally speaking, and there are always exceptions, but generally speaking, professors believe that those letters after their name give them the right to not associate with people who don't have letters after their name. Higher education in this country has traditionally been viewed as the way to acquire credentials which give you the right to not associate with those people you consider inferior. Consequently, professors are very reluctant to allow anybody without credentials, academic credentials, to participate in the design of curriculum, of programs of study, of courses. Professors believe that those numbers, those letters after my name, whether it's MA or MS or PhD or whatever, JJD or whatever it is, JDD, I guess, doctors of jurisprudence, lawyers, they believe that those letters entitle them to be independent and to make all the decisions affecting curriculum. Let's be straight. The reality of the game is that those people who teach in our colleges and university have never been able successfully to handle workplace education because, and I don't know how to say this, I got to be blunt about it, very few people in higher education have ever worked. In institutions that I've been in, faculty members believe that if you teach a class after 2 in the afternoon, it's night shift. They believe it ought to pay overtime. The idea of teaching classes on weekends and in the middle of the night and at 7 in the morning in order to accommodate people on their way to work and such, absolutely outrageous. College is for people who are ready for college. And more often than not, faculty members, if they were being honest, will say, the people who are worthy of college are already in college. The people who are out there working day to day in industry or at other kinds of jobs are there because they aren't college material. They aren't worthy of a college education. Consequently, the biggest, most expensive, most well-funded education system on the face of the earth has abandoned workplace education and left it to the employers themselves to train and educate their own workers. And we have had this disconnect between education and the workplace that we have never been able to find a way to surmount. That must end. We have got to find a way to make the changes necessary to connect our education system and its people with our working system and its people. We have got to make education meaningful in the real world. We have got to overcome the gaps and the prejudices that define our working relationships in this country. We need the spokesman for working people, the voice of labor. We need that voice when curriculum is being designed, when courses are being put together. If I'm teaching a course and I know that a third or a half or 2/3 or 3/4 of the students in my class are working people, and more that means working adults, then I've got to make sure that my class, my course, works for them. It's not something that defines another world from theirs. It's got to become a course or a class that helps them understand better the world they are in. In order to do that, we've got to have the voice of working people at the table when the courses and the programs of study are being put together and being created. Therefore, in the new age, new unions, representatives of working people, need to sit on college curriculum committees. They need to sit on advisory boards for 2- and 4-year colleges as they put together curriculum and programs and courses in areas like management and accounting and sales and psychology programs like interpersonal relations and public relations and communications and all of these other things that we all offer college degrees in. We've got to infuse the real world into those programs in order to make them relevant. And in order to do that, we need to call upon the voice of working people, bring it to the table, and welcome and solicit their input into what we're doing. If we don't do it, we can't be successful. We will continue to see a situation where higher education in this country will continue to be a commodity for the few, and the vast majority in this country will be unconnected to higher education, unable to afford it. Not only that, but they will develop the prejudices which look upon these people with some sense of reality as being elitists who think that they're too good to associate with me and with the people that I live with. We've got to break this down. This is part of what's driving the inequality in this country. We have got to open public education and make it relevant again. Public education, higher education, is being paid for and subsidized by taxpayers. Public colleges and universities get a significant portion of their budgets from state legislatures and from the federal government on the theory that what's happening and what's going on educationally in these institutions benefits the public interest. We have got to make sure that it does. It seems to me a redefined voice for working people can do that. Consequently, we need to make it happen. We need to put representatives of organized labor on every curriculum committee, on the advisory board, advisory council for every program. If we're going to offer the beginnings of a business degree for managers, for potential managers, then we've got to make sure that the people who can speak for those they will end up managing are heard and are there and are represented in the curriculum and the course of study that they take. I realize that the barriers and the obstacles that we would need to overcome in order to implement many of these things are huge. We've got to do them. Let me close because we've only got 2 minutes left in our program today, and I don't want to take the whole 2 minutes. So I'm going to stop very quickly. I saw this need 20 years ago. When I came to West Virginia in 1993, I incorporated a business called Training Arts. It is an operation which I've never been able to actually contribute, put any time or effort into because I've been fully employed. I'm now retired. I'm playing around with the idea of taking Training Arts off the shelf, so to speak. The purpose of Training Arts was to find ways to bring the voice of the campus and the voice of the workplace together. I'm beginning to see the emergence of the new capitalism as an opportunity to pull this off. And this is what I see, and this is what I plan to write about, and this is what I plan to do. Tell me all of this is not related to citizenship, on the future of the republic, on the future of the body politic, on the ability of people to look at the future positively rather than negatively. All the things that are critical to the future of this republic and to its constitutional system are inherent in this. If it's okay with you, I would like to continue this theme in tomorrow's program. But right now we have to call it a day. It's 59 minutes after the hour. You've been listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We'll be back tomorrow at our regular time, 1 to 3 p.m. in the East. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you for listening. I hope you'll be able to join us again tomorrow. Thank you.